They called it Canada's $34 billion tunnel to nowhere. Critics laughed. Protesters screamed. The world watched with folded arms as Canada decided to punch a hole straight through a mountain, just to move more oil. But here's the twist nobody saw coming. 1 year later, those same critics were eating their words. The project they mocked as madness, it became a geopolitical masterstroke that rewrote the rules of global energy trade. So what really happened when Canada bet everything on boring through solid rock? And why are former opponents now saying they regret dismissing this controversial pipeline? Let's dive into the most dramatic infrastructure comeback in Canadian history. Picture this. It's 1953, and welding teams are working around the clock, laying down 1,150 kilometers of steel from Edmonton to Burnaby. This wasn't just engineering, it was a declaration. Canada was done being caught short on fuel during wartime. That original Trans Mountain pipeline moved 150,000 barrels a day when it launched, doubling by the 1980s. Jet fuel flowed to Seattle, West Coast refineries stayed well fed. It worked. For a while. Then, Alberta's oil production didn't just grow, it exploded. By 2010, the province was pumping out more than 4 million barrels daily. But here's the problem. Nearly all of that oil had just one route, straight into the U.S. Like a leaky faucet with no pressure, value drained away. Rail cars packed with crude limped along congested routes. The old pipeline maxed out completely. Alberta producers watched helplessly as their oil sold at brutal discounts, sometimes $19 below U.S. benchmark prices. People began asking the hard question, was Alberta's wealth stuck forever? That's when the TMX twinning plan surfaced. Not a repair job, a full-scale expansion. Engineers mapped out a 1,000-kilometer steel shadow running parallel to the original line. But there was one massive obstacle: Burnaby Mountain. Their solution? Cut straight through it. Drill a tunnel wide enough to fit a subway train using a boring machine the size of a blue whale. And that wasn't all. The plan called for 52 trenchless crossings, slipping pipes silently under rivers, railways, and major highways. It was surgical precision. 10.6 million cubic feet of earth had to be displaced without blowing up half the suburbs. Noise barriers went up, water cannons shot dust out of the air, light shields turned night into soft shadows. The engineering was admired even by critics. But it didn't stop the criticism. When Kinder Morgan first filed for the pipeline expansion in 2013, the budget sat comfortably at 6.8 billion Canadian dollars. Manageable. Straightforward. Then reality punched the calculator. By 2018, with political tension rising and the original builder spooked, Ottawa stepped in and bought the entire Trans Mountain project for 4.7 billion Canadian dollars. To keep the dream alive, they said. But what followed made even optimists wince. By 2020, costs ballooned to 12.6 billion Canadian. In 2022, 21.4 billion Canadian. And by the time oil finally flowed through those pipes in 2024, 34 billion Canadian dollars. That's 5 times the original estimate. Finance blogs roasted it. Memes showed the pipeline wrapped in $100 bills. Cartoonists had a field day drawing oil executives joyriding down a golden roller coaster funded by taxpayers. So what happened? It wasn't just one disaster. It was a stack of them. The pandemic turned supply chains into a scrapyard. Steel doubled in price. One Granite Ridge near Kamloops refused to break, grinding drill bits into confetti. Landowners demanded reroutes. Contractors swapped work gloves for firefighting gear after 2 wildfires scorched project zones. Then came the insurance hikes, and the lawsuits, and the delays. On paper, it looked like a project spiraling completely out of control. Critics argued that Canada would never recover the money. But in the background, Ottawa's economists were doing a different kind of math. A 2023 report by Ernst & Young estimated TMX could add 9.2 billion Canadian to GDP and generate 2.8 billion Canadian in tax revenue through 2043. Even the Bank of Canada baked a 0.25% GDP bump into its 2024 forecast. Long-term, this wasn't just a pipe, it was a lever, a tool to shift Alberta's oil from discount bin to premium shelf. Laughter doesn't always come from joy. Sometimes it's born from disbelief. And for years, the Trans Mountain expansion was the butt of every joke in Canadian politics. Protest camps dotted the landscape like wildfire scars. Courtrooms turned into revolving doors for injunctions and appeals. And then came the number that triggered audible gasps: a sevenfold increase in tanker traffic through the Salish Sea. Environmental groups sounded the alarm. The southern resident killer whale population, already critically endangered, hovered around just 73 individuals. Marine biologists warned that even modest increases in ship noise could disrupt their echolocation, the very thing they depend on to hunt. Ottawa refused an emergency order to halt construction, offering instead something called adaptive management. Critics heard that as, "Trust us, we'll figure it out later." Indigenous nations led the most powerful opposition. The Tsleil-Waututh and others pointed out a basic truth. This was unceded territory. No pipeline should be laid without consent. Marches turned federal office lobbies into drum circles. Some investment firms joined the resistance, warning that TMX was a stranded asset in a world sprinting toward renewables. The media caught on quickly. One phrase made it from protest signs to editorial headlines: "Cutting through sacred land to fuel yesterday's economy." And that's when the real laughter began. At backyard barbecues and morning radio shows, people scoffed at the idea of spending 34 billion Canadian dollars on a project that even oil majors were backing away from. To many, it seemed like Canada had doubled down on a bet everyone else had already folded. Then came the legal twist. In 2020, the Supreme Court of Canada quietly declined to hear any more appeals. Just like that, the path cleared. Construction was a go. At 4:53 a.m. Pacific Time, inside a control room in Edmonton, someone pressed the button. Valve K710 hissed open. Digital gauges lit up as sensors confirmed rising pressure. Smooth and steady. A few minutes later, a dense stream of diluted bitumen, thick as syrup and dark as midnight, surged into motion. It was finally happening. The Trans Mountain expansion was no longer a blueprint or a bet, it was live. Cheers erupted across control rooms from Alberta to British Columbia. Engineers, technicians, and operators who had spent years staring at construction maps now watched the line pump crude toward the Pacific. They were ahead of schedule, months ahead, in fact. 5 days later, a tanker named Trans-Catalan docked at the Westridge Marine Terminal. Crews locked in the loading arms. Slowly, 550,000 barrels flowed aboard, destined for a refinery in Shenzhen, China. It was a first. Alberta crude skipping the United States entirely and heading straight to Asia at scale. Cameras rolled as the crew raised a banner on the gangway, from the mountains to the sea. Pipeline economics usually sound dry, until you realize they ripple straight into paychecks, tax refunds, and grocery bills. That's where the Trans Mountain expansion quietly changed the game. Let's start with royalties. For every dollar that the price gap between Western Canada Select and U.S. crude narrows, Alberta pockets an extra 210 million Canadian annually. After TMX went live, that discount shrank by nearly $4. Do the math, and you're looking at a windfall of roughly 850 million Canadian dollars for the province. Add in federal corporate tax revenue, and Ottawa's slice quickly pushes the total past $1 billion. And that's just royalties. Before TMX, Canada was moving about 180,000 barrels a day by rail. It cost producers a painful 15 Canadian dollars more per barrel, adding up to nearly $1 billion a year in what many called the rail penalty. Now, most of that money stays in country, environmental angle. Even better, switching from trains to pipelines slashes carbon emissions by up to 70% per barrel. Whenever critics accuse TMX of fueling a climate crisis, federal officials whip out that stat like a shield. Meanwhile, Asia wasted no time jumping on the new shipping lane. California refineries still take their share of heavy Canadian crude, but by the end of 2024, China was importing 207,000 barrels per day through TMX. A decade earlier, that number sat in the single digits. This diversification was no accident. In early 2025, a surprise U.S. tariff threat spooked the market, sending a reminder no one needed. Relying on a single buyer is dangerous. TMX broke that dependence. 1 year later, the scoreboard. Reflective. May 1st, 2025, dawned with the pipe humming at 740,000 barrels per day, 94% of nameplate capacity. Financial Pages ran retrospectives titled, "1 year later, Canada's most controversial pipeline hits its stride." Everybody laughed at those earlier doom posts circulating on social media. Memes paired before and after tanker photos with the caption, "They regretted it." China had become the single largest buyer of Canadian crude through TMX, nudging the United States into second place. Vancouver's harbor now managed 26 tanker departures per month, still under the eventual goal, but triple pre-expansion traffic. Public sentiment settled into pragmatic acceptance. Polling by Angus Reid showed national support near 51% versus 36% opposed, the narrowest gap since 2017. Opposition remained fierce among some coastal communities worried about marine spills, but even there, the feared tanker cacophony proved less intrusive than predicted, thanks to mandatory 11-knot speed limits and double-hulled designs. Insurance databases reported 0 spill incidents in year 1, evolving situation. Indigenous participation evolved as well. More than 20 communities entered equity discussions worth up to 30% of project value, a potential multi-billion-dollar stake. Revealing. Leaders who once blockaded gates began weighing board seats and revenue streams for housing and language programs. In private, some admitted they regretted walking away from earlier talks. Forward-looking. On February 6, 2025, Trans Mountain outlined an upgrade roadmap. Inject polymer drag-reducing agents, swap impellers, add 5 intermediate pump stations, and raise average line pressure by 15%. If regulators agree, throughput could rise by up to 300,000 barrels per day, pushing total capacity toward 1.19 million. The plan avoids fresh trenching, meaning no new mountains to cut through, which is vital because stakeholder fatigue is real. Early modeling predicts the upgrade could come online by late 2028, exactly when production growth pressure peaks. Capital cost would stay well under 3 billion Canadian, pocket change compared with the original expansion. If the upgrade proceeds, Canada will command a West Coast export artery rivaling any Latin American competitor. So, was the mountain worth cutting through? The evidence tilts yes, though not without caveats. Canada secured an exit door to world markets. Heavy crude producers clawed back billions. Ottawa gained leverage in a tariff-happy era. Environmental risk didn't vanish, but neither did it explode. 0 spills in year 1 beat skeptics' dire predictions. Tanker noise still troubles orcas, yet mitigation tech moves faster now that steady royalties fund research. Economic perspective. Economically, the project's $34 billion price tag no longer dominates headlines. Instead, conversations revolve around future capacity tweaks and potential privatization. If Indigenous-led consortia acquire TMX, the pipeline could become a model for resource reconciliation, something critics once deemed impossible. Still, vigilance is mandatory. A global pivot to electrification may squeeze heavy crude demand in the mid-2030s. TMX tolls must stay competitive. Spill response drills must remain ruthless. For now, though, even many former antagonists concede the obvious. They regretted dismissing Canada's grit. The same geology that challenged engineers now shields a steel artery feeding an energy-hungry Pacific. Everybody laughed at Canada for cutting through a mountain. But the laughter died when the first $1 billion in extra revenue rolled in. The project isn't a cure-all, yet it has rewritten the map and the narrative. In a world racing toward uncertain energy futures, that's no small win. So what's your take on Canada's Trans Mountain expansion? Smart strategic move or environmental mistake? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the stories that reshape our world. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.